There has been much discussion around Supreme Court reform during Biden's tenure, especially after the controversial strikedown of Roe v. Wade, student loan forgiveness, and corruption scandals in the court. Even though Biden said he would put Secretary of Transport Pete Buttigieg in charge of Supreme Court reform, little progress on this front has been revealed to the public. The U.S. Constitution is incredibly vague when it comes to many things regarding the Supreme Court, and this has caused controversy as much of the supposed rules we have for how the most powerful court in the U.S. is structured is based on precedent, and that precedent has been violated continually, whether that be people creating new rules like FDR's court packing or Mitch McConnell's Supreme Court nomination blockage under Obama. One thing that is quite unpopular to the American public when looking for structure for new political institutions is to evaluate how other countries do it. Yes, the U.S. has formed the basis of their legal systems primarily based on English common law, but for anything new, we principally think we are too unique to ever learn from other countries' governments. So for this video, I wanted to explore a multitude of ideas from the Supreme Courts around the world, evaluate if they can be any good if implemented in the U.S. One quick thing to point out before we start is that I do not have any sort of legal degree and could get things wrong. I'm not legal eagle. Please let me know in the comments if you notice any errors. Common in Latin America and Iberia is to have a specific constitutional court, separate from the Supreme Court. These courts have separate jurisdictions and help split up and better specialize in either constitutional rights issues or civil and criminal cases. So the first positive about this idea is that it might help with the backlog of cases, having more cases be heard. Right now, the Supreme Court really only hears about 100 to 150 cases out of the nearly 7,000 cases sent to it every year, which is about 1 to 2%. That is lower than the acceptance rate of Harvard. For the downsides, this might add more complexity and more controversy between cases that may exist in a gray area between the two courts. It would be difficult as well to introduce a new other highest court in the land as an institution to rival one of such power existing for over 200 years. Now for number 2, another popular proposal is to enshrine the amount of justices in the Constitution. This is done in many countries, for example, the Philippines, which is a court system that is a sort of hodgepodge between American and Spanish law. I feel like what's great about this is it helps stop court packing and over-politicization over the number of justices we have. The only big downside I see is that it would require a near Herculean effort to have enough agreement in Congress and among states for a constitutional amendment to be ratified. The third proposed change that is related to the second is the overall size of the Supreme Court. 9 justices might be limiting for such an important institution. Although I don't think the US should switch to Spain's 79 or India's up to 34 members, I think there might be something that works in between, like perhaps the Philippines' 15. One thing about the American Supreme Court of 9 that I don't think is a great thing is that they're all at least decently well known. I feel like if some become such household names like Kavanaugh or Ginsburg, perhaps that adds to the politicization. We are putting so much power into so few people, so is it really radical to say maybe we should just have a set number of justices? But just maybe that number should be more than 9. Okay, moving on. The fourth proposal to look at is the idea of creating separate chambers within the Supreme Court. This is done in several countries like Spain's 5 separate chambers or Indonesia's 7, which even includes a chamber for religious cases. They separate cases much more precisely between civil, criminal, military-based crimes, etc., and appoint justices with that specific area of expertise to each chamber. So looking at this, having 5 separate chambers is probably excessive here, and would likely create lots of jurisdictional disputes and infighting. Perhaps this can be done on a smaller scale, like splitting up civil and common constitutional law cases. The advantage of the Constitutional Court proposal here is that the courts are still kept together and are not seen as separate institutions, likely making it easier for the average American to digest. Now, this will again likely help the Supreme Court to be able to see more cases overall and add specialization. Still, though, this could cause disputes between the two. It would likely be best if we did implement this to have some sort of required gag order that forces the 2 chambers to not comment on the decision of the others. It's worth noting that the 2 separate chambers version here does exist in Italy, where one part of the court handles criminal, equivalent constitutional cases, and another civil. For the 5th proposal, we'll be looking at adding requirements for certain justices to come from certain regions like states or more likely federal districts. This would be like Canada that requires 3 of their Supreme Courts to be from Quebec by law, and has precedent for requiring other portions of their Supreme Court coming from other regions. So likely this will just be adding complication without much benefit for the US. Looking at current justices, all hail from at least different states. Justice Brown Jackson, be it from DC, and likely maybe the New York, New Jersey metro area is a little overrepresented historically, but it is the largest city and municipal justice system in the country, which provides more balance when you think about it. There is currently no justice from the West Coast, the closest being Gorsuch from Colorado, but there have been multiple California judges too. It's also important to remember that this is a federal court, which probably means it's best not to favor some states over others. So for the sixth proposal, we'll be looking at a pretty popular one at that, which is requiring term limits, or at least mandatory retirements. So first, looking at term limits, this likely would up the overall politicization of the court and probably clog up the Senate with constant reappointments and politicized hearings. For this to work, we need reform for how terms would be renewed, so that they're not so slow, perhaps renewed by Senate Judicial Committee vote. Now, for mandatory retirement age, this is super popular and, to be honest, likely a good thing. Now, with many questioning the mental capacity of our leaders due to advanced age, like President Biden and Senators Feinstein and McConnell, there seems to be broad bipartisan support for either some sort of mental capacity check or mandatory retirement laws. It would probably be best to not be excessive and put an age limit high, something like 75, or have some sort of bipartisan panel of doctors to assess for dementia. So many countries have some sort of mandatory retirement age for their Supreme Court, like the Philippines, Canada, Mexico, Nigeria, and Spain, and many more. Another side effect to point out that would be good from this change is that death while in office often causes an unplanned political circus, politicizes the death of the justices, and stalls the Senate, which is already a slow institution. If the justices could prepare more ahead for retirement, the whole process would likely be less politicized. The Senate and the president would be overall more prepared, and regular Senate activities wouldn't be interrupted all of a sudden. So moving on to the eighth proposal, which is minimum age, likely a minimum age of 35, like the president. It isn't a bad thing, but really with America's very mature government officials, this doesn't seem like a big need at the moment. The ninth proposal is to add a natural-born citizen requirement, which is surprisingly not a requirement. I'm sort of up in the air about this, as I do think that Supreme Court justices should have to renounce any other country's citizenship they have had to be appointed, but maybe something less restrictive, like requiring citizenship for 15 to 20 years before being a justice, would be good. The 10th proposal is a requirement that the justice candidate would have been a judge in lower courts before. I very much agree with this. It takes time and years of experience to be good at being a judge. This prevents controversial ideas like Justice Obama or Trump, or even Justice Taft, which we did have. It did at least first have them serve in lower levels of federal courts to build up experience before appointment. This might humble them enough to prevent it. In the UK, there is this requirement. The potential member must have held high judicial office for a period of at least 2 years or been qualified practitioner for at least 15 years before practicing. Okay, the 11th proposal is allowing suo motu cases. If you don't know what suo motu is, it's basically hypothetical cases. So in India, the Supreme Court and High Courts are empowered to frame suo motu cases without receiving the formal petitions, complaints on any suspected injustice, including actions, acts indulging in contempt of court and contempt of the Constitution by the executive, legislators, and citizens. Recently, some had criticized the U.S. Supreme Court case of 303 Creative versus Elenis, where a wedding designer wanted to deny the right to provide services for a gay wedding as a suo motu case, as the request for the wedding turned out to be fake. Whether you think that case was lawful or not, I think suo motu cases are likely a bad idea. There's enough of a backlog of real cases to decide on. Hypothetical question laws are better to be answered by Congress, although they are rare to do that, to be honest. The 12th idea, adding the justices in the line of presidential succession, which they have in Brazil, is likely a bad idea. Supreme Court justices really aren't appointed for political charisma and leadership capabilities. A situation like President Thomas or Sotomayor could lead to a lame duck presidency and could also cause more issues because they were never elected. Overall, it's much better to take from either the House or Senate leadership, who were at least elected, although only by their district or state, but then at least by the representatives of all other states. The third one is requiring bilingualism on the court, likely English and Spanish. This is now required in Canada after Trudeau law, and I think it would be overall bad. It would limit the justice pool in the country, which is not very bilingual. We should, however, continue to offer services to people speaking other languages involved in court battles. Number 14. Have the Supreme Court recommend nominations to the president. This is done in India, but I think it gives the unelected Supreme Court more power. It really could just cause them to become too much of an echo chamber, so sorry, number 14. And the last one, number 15, would be to copy Argentina. It would require 2/3 Senate approval for nominations. While I think this would help with consensus, and maybe in the past this was more likely, right now, with our current politicization, I don't think we could ever nominate a justice with 2/3 at this point. So that was the 15 possible Supreme Court changes based on foreign Supreme Courts. Do you agree with my opinions or have different arguments? Did I miss a helpful change from a foreign Supreme Court that you would like to add? If so, make sure to tell me about it in the comments, and I'll make sure to respond. This is Chispa de Geopolitics, and make sure to like and subscribe.